I'm the chair of the committee, Roger Horton. With me is Councilmember Snyder and Councilmember Falcone. Today's agenda consists of 3 items: redevelopment agency report, fiscal year 2009 interim statements, and a review of the infrastructure financing task force. So we'll start with item 1, which is the redevelopment agency fiscal year report. Mr. Pearson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Pearson, Finance Director, and the interims before you. The first set are the interim financial statements for the redevelopment agency for the 5 months ended November 30th. And really, again, still not a whole lot to say about the redevelopment agency because these are through November. These do not reflect the property tax receipts that we got in December. So through November, we'd only received about $2.7 million of our property tax increment, about 19% of the budget. That's not unusual through November. In fact, it might even be a little high for a traditional through November. As you know, really the only thing on the RDA that I think is worth mentioning is the ERAF shift, which we have to pay by May, and we will be coming to you in the next several weeks with an agenda item to seek your authority under protest anyway to pay the ERAF payment, because under the law the legislative body has to approve the payment, and so we'll be doing that. But other than that, really not a whole lot to report. Of course, there will be more to report after next month, December, when we have the mid-year review and we have the first chunk of property taxes in the books for the agency.
We have a question from Ms. Falcone.
This is either for you, Mr. Pearson, or maybe for Mr. Bossy. Last year, last year, we put aside. I've lost the year. It may have been as much as 2 years ago. But we put aside $700,000 or something of that nature in anticipation that the state was going to do an ERAF shift on us. And in that they are in structural deficit to the tune of $42 million, at least that's the number today. Are we anticipating forward in our RDA budget, or you haven't done the budget for RDA yet? Tell me a little bit about your thinking on that. Are we going to anticipate that they're going to take again from us and set it aside like we have in the past?
Good afternoon. My name is Brian Bossy. I'm with the Redevelopment Agency. We haven't gotten that far into our planning for fiscal year 2010 yet. We have in the past, when we knew it was when we knew an ERAF was coming, we would try to set aside funds for that if we did know the actual amount. This past year, we did not know the amount when we went through the budget process, so we just had to hang on until just recently. If we know the amount, I don't think it would hurt to set it aside. Of course, as you know, there are a number of groups who are opposing this and seeking some legal relief from the ERAF shift, so we're waiting to see how that...
There's a lawsuit being brought by the redevelopment agency at the state level. Yes.
That's correct, yeah. It can go either way. I guess we'll have to plan that out when we run through the budget process. Okay.
I was just curious because I think that in the state of affairs that the state is in at this point, the case that's wending its way through the courts at the state level is going to take a while. So I'm not really sure that for 2010 we should count on that issue being resolved. And I would suggest that maybe we look at anticipating at least some money being set aside in the event that they do choose prior to the decision. And I'm not really sure that RDA is covered by 1A, but that's for the courts to decide. But it'll go to the Supreme Court, I'm sure. So that's going to take a while.
Mr. Chair, I just would add to that unless by some miracle the state actually resolves its budget situation within the next 6 months or so, I think staff would probably be approaching the 2010 RDA budget the same way we approached the 2009, which is to say, after allocating for operations and debt service, we would put the rest of the budget on hold as we did this year until we see what the state does to us, and then be prepared to move forward after that. I mean, that's what we did this year, and we've actually done that more than once in the past when it appeared likely that we would be subject to an ERAF shift, but didn't know the amount or the extent. So,
One more question here.
Well, first, a clarification. The $700,000 was general fund set aside, not RDA, and I think the RDA amount was $1.4 million. That's listed from the state as what the take could be, depending on the court case. Is that correct?
That is correct. I understood the question is
Isn't
we
one-
have set aside in
Yeah,
the past for
in the
it.
past
Right.
we have. It,
But
and it
this-
was RDA
But the
money.
700,000 was general fund money, not RDA money.
I'm not talking about this year. I'm talking about in years in a couple
Okay.
of years past. The amount today is 1.4 out of the RDA.
Okay. I did have a question about a few months ago when this committee and the council looked at the reallocation of funds coming in and what's left and, you know, the different projects coming in. And when do we see that in these documents? Because some of the projects now are going away, some we added more money to, some we added less money to. Could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. We're currently working on that process right now with the finance folks. It's very detailed, and so what we've been doing is trying to set aside the different accounts with certain funding levels and position those according to the appropriate project as the board approved on December 16th. So we are working through that process right now, and we should see that in the coming months.
Okay, thank you.
I have another comment or question. I'm looking at page 5 of the RDA report, which I always do, and I'm wondering if there's a way of, if not revising how this report looks, at least putting a supplemental page or maybe even an additional page. When we see the year-to-date actual of 1.9, encumbrances of 4.3, and then the remaining balance of 17.5, it's hard to get a feeling for that's like on track or we're way behind or we're in the process of having design done. Is there some way of clarifying this summary page? Because I keep wanting to ask questions and then we keep getting to the point of, well, it's in process, it will show up as time goes on. So is there something you could do to clarify where these projects are in the mill, as it were?
yeah, Mr. Chair, I would say that would have to be a separate schedule because really these are intended to be financial statements, and what I think I'm hearing you ask for is some sort of explanatory or supplemental information.
Yes.
I think in part that's why Mr. Bossi is here. He is my supplemental information.
Yeah, I just don't want to go through, each item here at this meeting. I think if you could just, a lot of these questions that I have are easily answered, that you haven't let the contract yet, or there's something along those lines. That's all I'm asking for. Is nothing real complex, but I think it has to be an additional supplemental page.
Sure, we'd be happy to do that. Actually, what we do now is we do provide the entire agency board with a quarterly report that goes into more detail about each particular project. And I am Mr. Pearson's supplemental information. I've been called worse, so I'll take that. But you're always welcome to give me a call as well. But we do provide those quarterly reports, and hopefully those can address most
Okay,
of your
they don't
concerns.
come along with this report, so
No.
if you could attach that for me, at least if no one else wants it, I'd like to see that.
Sure.
Okay, is there a motion?
I'll move this to council.
Is there a second?
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right, Mr. Pearson, next item.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The second set of interim financial statements is for the city for the same 5-month period ended November 30th. And again, we have spent some time, considerable time really, talking to the council and the finance committee about the general fund. As recently as last Thursday, as you well know, we had a budget work session which focused on the general fund. So I don't think there's a whole lot to add to the general fund data that you have already received. I would mention that if you look at page 1 of the actual financial statements right behind the agenda report, and I did mention this Thursday in the budget work session, there are a couple of our enterprise funds which, while still obviously in solid financial condition, their revenues this year are showing the effects of the economic situation. I specifically would point you to the golf course, where through about 42% of the fiscal year, we've received about 36% of the revenue. As I mentioned on Thursday, I think that there is some reflection of the impact of the economic situation on the golf course revenues, but it is also true to say that the number of rounds at Muni have been declining gradually over the last couple of years, which is consistent with the nationwide average of golf courses. So that is something we're keeping an eye on. The downtown parking fund at 38% of the revenue through 42% of the year is slightly behind the curve, and that's something we're keeping an eye on as well. I mean, not that there's a lot we can do about that, but certainly keeping an eye on it to allow us to make any adjustments to the budget that might be warranted based on weaker than expected revenues. As you know, in most cases, we can't really directly control the revenues, at least not mid-cycle or mid-budget year, and all we can do is react to the revenue situation by trying to control expenses in order to keep the funds in balance. Other than that, I mean, if you look at the water fund, that's on track, and as is the wastewater fund. In fact, they're both slightly ahead of the revenue curve. The airport fund is basically right on the revenue curve. And those are the major enterprise funds. The waterfront is just barely ahead of the revenue curve, 44% collected through 42% of the fiscal year. So I think all in all, while there may be a couple spots that we're paying particular attention to, the enterprise funds seem to be holding their own well. And since we had talked extensively about the general fund, I really wasn't going to make any other comment other than to point out that hopefully by tomorrow, I think maybe even later today, we will have for you an update on the December transient occupancy tax numbers. And I know that in speaking to Kathy Janega Dykes of the Conference and Visitors Bureau and Film Commission, she, based on feedback from her group and the Lodging Association, was expecting that we would see something in the neighborhood of a double-digit decline in our TOT for December. She basically said the first half of December was an absolute bomb and that it recovered slightly in the second half, but that's not a strong half of the month anyway because of the holiday season. So we are fully expecting to see a double-digit decline in TOT in December. But we hopefully will have that information for you by tomorrow at the latest.
Okay. I didn't have any questions. Anybody else? Is there a motion?
A move to council.
Second?
Second.
Moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. All right. On to the task force report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, Bob Pearson. And the third item on our agenda today is bringing back to you once again the report and recommendations from the Infrastructure Financing Task Force. You'll recall that back in October, the task force presented the council with their recommendations. And then on November 11th, we were before the Finance Committee with a summary of their recommendations. And you recall, I know, that we had members of the committee here at that time to present to the Finance Committee a summary of their recommendations and answer any questions you might have in terms of what their thoughts and thinking was on that. And then in the wake of that November 11th meeting, the Finance Committee meeting, basically staff said that we would go away and put together for you a schedule and process for sort of systematically going through the recommendations of the Infrastructure Financing Task Force, and that's what brings us to you today. I want to say that our intent, staff's intent on today's agenda item is not necessarily to talk about substance. In fact, it isn't our intent that we would be talking substance, but rather that we'd be talking process and having you look at what we've put together in terms of a possible scenario for a process of going through the task force's recommendations. And so that's what we would like to do. And if the committee's ready, I would sort of dive right into that.
All right, I think that's where we should be heading today, so let's proceed.
Thank you. Thank you. Basically, we've taken the task force recommendations and categorized them into essentially 5 groupings. And I thought we'd go through the groupings and take a quick look at each of the items that we've put into the groupings. And again, to me, the purpose of doing this today is to say, if you think, for instance, we've put something in a wrong grouping or you would like us to change the approach. And then in the end, we'll talk about also scheduling because we put some tentative dates to the various groupings. But one of the options that I thought I would at least offer the committee is rather than coming to you every Tuesday over the course of the next 3 or 4 months when I know your plate's going to be full with budget and other things, there certainly is at least an option to consider a special meeting of the committee to consider one or more of these categories so that we could sort of get some momentum built and staff's prepared to do it either way at the pleasure of the committee. So that's something I want to mention, and then we can talk about that at the end. So the first category you see there is that in the green at the top of page 1, we've labeled items in process or future policy options. And in terms of the future policy options, I want to say that we've spent a lot of time over the last bit talking about the current economic environment and the impact on the city's general fund in terms of our revenue. And we all know after Thursday's work session that we're looking at a fairly substantial budget gap for next year that staff will be working to close in order to present the council with a balanced budget for next year. Unfortunately, as you know, a number of the primary recommendations of the task force would require a reordering of our fiscal priorities within the general fund, specifically to put more money into infrastructure and capital within the general fund. And I think it's safe to say that from staff's perspective, the timing in terms of the economy and the impact on the general fund revenues and the general fund budget outlook is probably not ideal for considering
Well, no, that's the understatement of the month. I mean, really.
Diverting more operating money away from operations into capital. And so I think from a staff perspective, as we go through these, keep in mind that a number of these recommendations that I think staff probably thinks are good ideas and there's things that we should at least talk about and hash out that maybe the next, unfortunately, 12 to 18 to 24 months may not be the ideal time to be talking about implementing some of these recommendations. And so as we go through that, I just wanted to mention that up front so that you could keep that in mind because I think it influenced where staff puts some of these items in these categories. So the items in process or future policy options, the task force recommended a change in the CIP document, the capital improvement plan document. That's kind of just do it. The partnerships, they've recommended expanding the use of private-public charitable partnerships, and I think that staff feels that we would obviously keep our eyes open, as I know the council does, for any opportunities to do those. And so to me, that's one of those things that was just a constant ongoing effort.
This would be currently the Junior League and the library project, I think, would fall into that category.
I think that's a great example.
Redevelopment of the children's wing.
The financing options, using the general fund to provide backing of debt for various enterprise funds as needed. We're proposing to do that for the airport. I would say that in most cases we don't think that's necessary, that most of our enterprise funds, virtually all of them, can stand on their own when issuing debt. I think the airport, because of the size and scope and because they're a first-time issuer, it's a little different. But certainly we will continue to consider that as necessary as long as it does not compromise the city's general fund ability to meet its own infrastructure needs. One of the recommendations was to assess the potential for adding a half-cent local sales tax as a new funding source for critical infrastructure projects, specifically the task force, and it didn't show up here, and I'm sorry for that. The task force mentioned their recommendations were put together prior to the November election date, and part of the recommendation that doesn't show here was if Measure G or Measure A should fail, that the city should consider adding a half-cent local sales tax. And then it said and/or for funding source, as a funding source for critical infrastructure projects in the future. So it was really two-pronged, and I apologize for having left out that first prong on that. Explore options for collateralizing and bonding future revenue streams, such as the city's share of state gasoline tax. That is something that we would keep an eye on. I think in general, staff feels that that's not always a good idea. In fact, in many cases is not, because essentially what you're doing is you're borrowing from the future. You're taking future gas tax monies and you're spending them now and then paying them back. But certainly there are times when that would be appropriate, and staff will continue to evaluate those on a case-by-case basis. Maintain the option of issuing new voter-approved general obligation bonds. I think that's something, obviously, that we keep an eye on, and I know the council does as well. Again, I'm not sure that right now, with the economic environment being what it is, it's the time to be asking for that, but that's certainly always an option. And then the resolve community issues, enforce existing panhandling ordinances, and dealing with the public safety gang problem. So,
Question?
Question. Well, on the last one, those two things, the dealing with the gang problem and enforcing and enhancing the existing panhandling ordinances is underway and should be on the ground and complete in the very near future. So that being said, as I understood your introduction, you don't want our input on whether or not we think these are good ideas at this point. You just are looking for us to think that all the things in the green box belong in the green box and all the things in the yellow box belong in the yellow box. Is that pretty much it? So you don't...
Councilmember Falcone, that's exactly it.
Okay.
That's exactly it. Because for the things that we will be bringing back to you, we will be having substantive policy discussions for those. And frankly, staff, other than the common knowledge like you just cited, didn't come today to prepared to talk specifically about substance.
Any of these other ones?
Right.
Because the first one, the change in the CIP document and resolving the community issues, while I don't want to go so far as to say they will be resolved, but they will certainly be
They're items in
meaningfully
process, yes.
addressed. But the rest of them are tricky and need a fair amount of discussion as to whether or not they're good ideas, and that's not what we're doing today.
That's correct.
I just wanted to be really clear.
That's correct.
Okay, because I don't want anybody to think that by our not saying anything with respect to whether we think these are good ideas or not, that we're tacitly agreeing that they are good ideas and folks should go forward with them. We're not weighing in on that at this point. Very similarly, when we had the budget discussion the other day, there was a laundry list that was handed out of possible options that could happen. And I know that I received, and I'm sure everybody else received, at least a dozen emails about the downtown parking free time going away. That discussion has not been had yet at all. It's just a laundry list of possibilities that we haven't discussed yet. That's the same as we're doing here today.
That's absolutely right.
Just to be really
Yeah, and
clear.
I was really disappointed that one of our local media outlets referred to that parking thing as a proposal, because we went to great lengths to say that it was not a proposal, that it was a part of a brainstorm list, and there were other media outlets at that work session that managed to get that right.
Well-
But somehow it turned out to be a proposal, which it clearly was disclaimed as not being. And so I was just disappointed, because I saw the same emails that were generated, in my opinion, unnecessarily, because that was not a proposal.
Yeah, I don't want to wag my finger at anybody,
Well,
but
I
just so
do.
everybody, well, evidently you did, so, you go forth and wag away. But I just want people to be very, very clear that these are none of these things are things that we have put in place or are even considering as good ideas. They're just out there on the table for people to consider, and that there will be other things to consider as well. So, we're looking for additions to these lists as well. So, thanks.
One more wag.
Wag away.
No, I won't indulge myself. Okay, that was the first category. The second category relates to the category of reserves, and this is a category which I know even before the Infrastructure Financing Task Force had completed their work, that this committee had talked about wanting to revisit, because really, as you well know, those policies were established by resolution in 1995. So it's been essentially 13 years since those were adopted, and I think we would all agree that that's a period of time that would warrant a revisiting of those reserve policies. And so the first of them, and I'm just going to hand these out. This is not to go over them. This is to make sure you have copies for your reference. These are the two resolutions that were adopted in 1995 to establish the city's reserve policies, 95, 156, and 157. So we would come back to you and review these, and then there are additional issues that were raised by the task force regarding our capital reserve requirements, about funding depreciation and facility renewal costs at replacement rather than book value, about revising our financial policies to implement and achieve a 10% annual off-the-top general fund capital allocation. And that's, I think, kind of some of these things I was talking about, that maybe some of these are worthy of discussion at a policy level, but may not be, the time may not be right to implement some of them. But I certainly think we can revisit the policy statements and really give some good thought to what should the city's reserve policies be, whether what we currently have still fits the bill, or whether they should be revised in one way or another. And I think we can separate that policy discussion when we have it from the practical matter of funding those reserves. And I use the budget reserve as an example. Right now, as we all know, the budget reserve is about, a little less than $1 million when the policy says it should be 10.5. I don't think it's necessarily realistic to expect that we'd be able to replenish that reserve within the next year or 18 months, 24 months, simply because we're going to be dealing in crisis mode. But that's not to say we can't have a meaningful discussion about what the policy should be, even if we can't get back to those policy levels over the next year or two. So, and that's really what we're talking about in this yellow box, about the whole thing about policy levels and what should our policy be.
This is an area of really major significance to this committee and to the city, and it's one that we need to focus on in future meetings. It's one thing to look at the 95 policies and then to discuss whether those policies need to remain as they are, to be changed in some way, increased or decreased. And then another issue, which is very important in times of economic difficulty, is how do we respond to those policies that are in place? And as you suggested, with the operating revenues down, the ability to fully fund these policies is difficult. But I think we all believe that whether the economy improves in 1 year, 2 years, or 5 years, at some point the revenues will be coming back. And to have a discussion about how we respond when the situation permits us to respond in a favorable way is something that's important, because we're all sitting here at the beginning of 2009 with a pretty drastic and dire situation, and the way that we look at these issues facing the city and the need for operating budget revisions is upon us. It's here, it's real, and it's something we have to take action on in a little while. But to clarify for future finance committees and future councils, our thoughts at this time as far as future city response is something that would be worthwhile doing. And so for me, this is one of the most important things that we can work on. And I don't know if you want to talk about timetable for that. I know we have the actual operating budget issues coming up before us. So is that something you want to integrate as we go along, or wait until we get past some operating budget items, or how would you like to handle that?
Councilmember Horton, actually, this is the yellow box would be the first set of issues that we would propose to bring back to the committee, and we would propose to begin that discussion by the end of this month. There's no meeting over the MLK for the MLK week, but I think we could be prepared by the end of this month to begin that discussion over the reserve policies.
I think that's a good thing to do. And you mentioned earlier the possible need for additional meetings or more. I don't know that we can handle that discussion on top of the operating budget reviews that we'll be doing. So we may need to work on adding some additional meetings in so that we can work on that during this timetable here.
I think that would be productive, but I'm very sensitive to your time, know how busy you all are, and that I leave it up to you. But I think if we could, especially on the reserves, if we had a block of an hour and a half or 2 hours that we could really get into it. I know that I'm going to be able to provide you with a lot of good data from other cities. I have some data from Moody's Investor Services, the rating agencies. They survey cities across the state and country in terms of their reserve levels and the like. And so I think we'll have some good data to go on.
Mr. Chair, I would be more than happy to make time available in my schedule for this discussion. I agree with you that I think that it's really one of the most fundamental discussions that we need to have, and although we may not be the council that responds to it in whatever future timeline we are able to, I think that having that discussion, weighing in on it with respect to the levels and how we do that is a valuable conversation. So I'd be more than happy to make that available.
Yeah, I agree that this is probably the most important thing that as a council we're going to have to work on is the budget, and so whatever time is necessary to adequately put it in. I would ask, in looking at the timing of this, there are two things going on in terms of also educating the general public about what we're doing. They're hearing a lot about the general fund budget, and this is the infrastructure financing task force, which is something different, although they're interrelated because some of these recommendations relate to the general fund budget, but they're not completely the same. And so as we have these meetings, to really be clear about the two different things that we're working on here. This one, to me, is much more setting policies for much more long-term strategies about infrastructure, although some of them will have impacts short-term on the general fund budget. And then we have these other conversations about the immediate need of the general fund. So I think that's going to be very important for us to make those distinctions when we have these meetings, and so they're not mixed together or not perceived to be mixed together. But I agree. I think if it means we take Tuesday mornings and work on budget issues and then Tuesday afternoon for council, that's fine with me. That's part of what we need to do.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I think you've heard from us on that.
Okay, and then on the page 2, on the back side, you'll see a green box with a number of recommendations, and these essentially are budget issues. The first of which is a recommendation to fully fund the annual facility renewal costs general fund of approximately $2.1 million and conduct the work on a regular basis. Make the funding of a new police station and adequate fire and emergency disaster facilities the highest infrastructure priorities for the general fund. And to reduce the city's operating costs and to free up funds for infrastructure financing by sunsetting underutilized and outdated programs, implementing zero-based budgeting at least once every 4 or 5 years, evaluating general fund facilities and property that aren't currently utilized or are underutilized to see if there are options for better utilization or for disposal even, and then again the disposing of any surplus property that might have utility value and generate income if leased or sold. So that would be another category that we would then talk about after the reserves discussion is done.
Schneider?
Yeah, a question on this one. The prioritized capital, given the meetings we had with the redevelopment agency and allocating over $8 million for the police headquarters and the additional money that we've put in over time to the fire station, aren't we already doing this? Doesn't this fit in the green box in some sense, and it's just sort of a formality of calling it top priority if we're already moving forward with these projects?
Councilmember Schneider, I would say that that's a fair statement. And keep in mind that the task force recommendations were put together late last fall before some of the decisions were made, for instance, on the scope of the improvements to the police department building. And so
I'm just saying, given today you're asking us, does the green stuff in the green belong in the green or move in the yellow? I would suggest that one actually belongs to go from, I guess, what color is that? Sea
Light
green
green
to
pea green.
chartreuse green or whatever, because of the actions we've already taken. And if we need to pass some formal resolution document or whatever to say that the public safety facilities are the top priority, we can easily do that. But in terms of allocating funding, we've said we wanted to. So.
I mean, that's up to the committee. I think it's a reasonable approach. These were judgment calls in terms of what box or color to put them in. So that's why we're here today, is to find out your input on how we did in putting them in the boxes.
Question, Ms. Falcone?
Well, it's not so much of a question as it is just weighing in on that issue, I guess. I would like to see it as something that we keep at the full front, and putting it in the chartreuse box, it makes it almost something that can be easily thought of as we are doing it, so we don't need to pay as much attention to it. There's so much more infrastructure need, not only in the police building, but for the police facilities and many of the fire stations. It's not just Station 1, that I would like to keep it actually at the forefront. This box keeps it at the forefront. We do need to pass something that brings that up to speed, although in the resolution 95-156 for number 2, it says budgetary emphasis will focus on providing high-quality municipal services, recognizing the fundamental importance to the public of public safety and well-maintained infrastructure. So we have it enunciated actually in a resolution. However, I think to really call it out and really say to the community that we recognize their priority, because when we polled for Measure G, they gave us their priorities. Public safety was number 1. Infrastructure was number 2. So I don't want it to get lost. I understand Ms. Schneider's your comment about well, we are putting a lot of money, but it's so minimal in the scheme of things that I really I think it's just barely a start as opposed to we're doing it. So those are my 2 cents.
I have a comment further on the light green. The comment here on the third category of zero-based budgeting, that's one that we, as a finance committee, haven't really had a chance to comment on. And I have, in a previous employment, had experience with that. And I don't know that I necessarily agree with the committee's recommendations in that regard. To do a really valid zero-based budgeting process is going to take a lot of resources and a lot of commitment. And before we would do that or accept it as a recommendation that we want to go forward with, I think we should talk about it as a process that we think will be worth the effort. So that's one I'd want to discuss in some detail before we embarked on it.
Councilmember Horton, I think that in this green box at the top of page 2, that is the category that we would bring to the committee for consideration of the policy decisions to be considered and maybe made or not made right after we finish the discussion of the reserves and reserve policies and things like that.
That sounds
so
perfect.
I think you will have that opportunity.
Okay, great. Moving on.
The blue box that is next on the list, fees and organization, and the recommendation F9, establish fair market rates for slip fees and other boating fees in the harbor, and that are comparable to similar Southern California cities and sufficient to cover the full direct and indirect costs of providing marina services, and then designate the waterfront department as responsible for the operation, maintenance, and support of all recreation boating, thereby boating harbor activities to the east of Cabrillo Boulevard. I would say south, but I don't know, of Cabrillo Boulevard, including the operation of the bathhouse, East Beach, and associated facilities, thereby freeing up the general fund to pay for other infrastructure improvements in the Parks and Rec department. So these are structural changes, if you will, and really we put these, I think they belong together in a blue box or some comparable colored box, but we put them towards the end of the process because I think, as you undoubtedly heard at the budget work session last Thursday, structural changes are one of the items that we're evaluating as part of the 2010 budget development process. And so I think by putting these down here, consideration of these items specifically may well be overtaken, and maybe appropriately so, by the FY 2010 budget discussion, rather than considering them here as a part primarily of the task force's recommendations. And then I think the hope is you see that this goes into April. Well, the budget, is filed in early April. Once we see what that is at, then we could possibly, if there are other issues that still linger from these recommendations, we'd be able to take them up there. But my guess is that some of these things will be taken up and considered as part of the budget. So
when we realize the extent of the issues that we're trying to address this year, something of this nature almost has to be included early as possible. So I think what you say is an appropriate way to address that, because we can't really wait to discuss it too much later. Question?
Not on the blue box, but just on the times in general. I'm making an assumption here for each of the boxes. When you say meet weekly, it looks like we have 1 week per topic. 3 weeks for 3 items. There's 2 weeks here for 2 items. Are you suggesting that we go one by one per meeting?
No.
Or, okay.
No.
Good, because my suggestion was that each different colored box are interrelated.
Agreed.
So we need to talk about them as a group, not individually.
We agree.
Okay.
And what we were just trying to do is put a range of dates to give you an idea that if we were to just use our normal Tuesday meeting times,
I see.
How long we thought from a staff perspective it might take to get through each of these boxes, the colors. And the agenda report mentioned, and I know you noticed, that if we were to do that on, the regular Tuesday meeting cycle, that say we started with the reserve policies as staff is recommending, that once we got through that, whether it was, by February 24th or a little later or a little earlier, that we would simply move right on to the next.
Okay. And that makes sense based on our other comments earlier of having block times, separate times for this.
Exactly.
I would suggest, though, just moving forward, that we may want to have a meeting at the end that wraps it all together, because we'll be talking about each particular thing on its own, but we're going to want something that shows how does this, just like we're doing now, we're looking at the whole picture from the beginning, we're going to want something similar at the end to see how it all fits together before we launch into the next the next budget cycle for the fiscal year 10.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Schneider, I would agree with that. I think that once we get through all of these, we would pull it all back together, and because sometimes when you deconstruct things into their components, when you put them back together again, it may not dovetail. We may have. So we agree.
All right. Question, Ms. Falcone.
Yeah. So let me just try to understand what you're thinking here. When we had the conversation just a few minutes ago about talking about the reserves and the policies that have to do with the reserves, I took that to mean, and I think it's a good idea, that is culled out separately. And so that is a topic for an individual meeting, because it doesn't really, it relates to, everything relates to everything. It's all a spider web, and it all, is integrated. But that's a conversation that really stands on its own in many respects. I do think that a lot of these items are going to actually be absorbed in the general discussion of the budget. It is all interrelated. So a number of these are actually going to be discussed on that level. So I guess my question is, then what are we left with after we cull out the reserves and we look for the logical conversations that are going to happen with regard to the regular budget process? There are some items here that don't fit into either one of those categories, and so we are left with some balance for some other meeting time, not when we talk about the reserves, but when we talk about. So I guess what I would ask is that we look at that and try to make as much efficient use of our time, because, for instance, whether or not we collateralize things, that's that doesn't fit in the normal budget that I can see, really. I mean, I suppose it could. You know, lawyers can fit anything anywhere, pretty much. But so I guess if we cull out what logically is going to be discussed elsewhere, then what are we left with? And I'm not sure this list, as it is constituted at the moment, should be the list that we work from. Mr. Pearson.
Councilmember Falcone, I think that this list is based on the recommendations of the task force, and next to each one of these items, you'll see a reference, like
Yes.
an F9 or an M2. And I think my understanding, and if I'm mistaken, I'm happy to be corrected now, is that the role of the Finance Committee in this is to review all of the recommendations of the task force and to prepare recommendations back to the full council as to which of these we should implement, how we should implement them, when we should implement them, if we should implement them,
Well,
and in what manner. And so that was my understanding of the role of the Finance Committee. And so what we're presenting to you are the task force's recommendations. And I think my own thought is that each one of them deserves some review to see whether the committee is interested in suggesting to the full council that, yes, that's one we should implement and this one isn't, and, well, we think this one should be modified and implemented in this modified manner. That is my framework.
I guess I mean, that's all well and good, and that's a starting place. You know, the recommendations from the task force. They threw a lot of stuff at the wall after a lot of consideration and came up with some excellent ideas for us to consider. I guess what I'm saying is to take it another step and do a little more work here at this level before we decide what's a good idea and whether it should be implemented or not. I think we need to see how some of these actually do integrate with the general budget discussion. And I guess I'm asking for a little more in-depth analysis before we just go thumbs up or thumbs down recommendation to the council. Do you understand what I'm saying? It's a little more. It's another meeting, I guess, to say this one goes, this one stays, and then after that we can have the discussion about whether or not we think they're a good idea and should recommend them to the council and how they should be implemented.
I guess we'll see.
That's kind of why I raised the question about zero-based budgeting. It was that point. That's a recommendation
understands what I'm saying.
M3. And what I was trying to say was that's a comment that was made, or a recommendation made by the task force. But I personally, as an individual and through previous experience, I'm not sure that's a good idea. So, but it's not for me to decide. It's for a discussion to happen on that. And then after the committee has decided what it wants to do with it, then I guess a recommendation forward to council. So that was why I made that comment, at least on that item there, that's what I thought we were going to be doing in this committee.
I think that's exactly how you have it presented, Mr. Pearson. We're looking at each of these items. We're going to have a discussion about what our comments on based on the recommendations by the Infrastructure Task Force. That's what we were asked to do when the report came to us. And it's a baseline, and how that relates to the next fiscal year budget is going to depend on some of the information you're working on now in terms of preparing for the fiscal year 10 budget. But as I said earlier, a lot of these recommendations have to do with long-term planning and policies that go beyond one fiscal year. It goes way into the future. So to have that discussion now seems to make sense. And then as some of these might relate to the next fiscal year, whether we implement them next fiscal year or sometime in the future, we can make that decision as part of the general budget process.
Yeah, I think what Ms. Falcone is asking for is what I was figuring we would be doing. So I'm fine with, having a thorough discussion here. And if that takes 2 meetings on a topic or whatever it takes, that's fine.
I agree with that. I mean, we want to take whatever time is necessary to adequately consider all of these things, and I mean, that was really the plan, was that we were going to come back to you, and all we were trying to do was organize the material, the topics, the recommendations in such a way that, at least from a staff perspective, seemed to be logical, theme-based groupings that would facilitate a broader discussion of issues. That's all we were really trying to do. And if this model doesn't serve that purpose, then we're happy to go take another shot at it.
No, I guess what I was saying, and you know, I appreciate all the work that has gone into this. I guess I would approach it slightly differently, but this is fine. It'll get the job done, and it's straightforward and simple enough, so we can go forward with that.
Okay, Mr. Pearson, did you want to cover the remaining?
Yeah, there's the purple box, which is one of the task force recommendations was that the city needs to do a better job of communicating with citizens, taxpayers, about the city's infrastructure needs and what we're doing to meet them, where we're doing well, where we need to improve, and those sorts of things. And so we thought after we got through some of the substantive discussions that we would present to the Finance Committee some thoughts that we have about how we could accomplish that, because I think I'll speak for myself. I think that's a good idea. I think it's an important thing that the community be aware of how we're doing in this regard, because it's been said before, and I certainly concur, that the maintenance of our infrastructure is certainly one of the top priorities, in my opinion, of a local government. And I think that communicating that to the citizens and taxpayers is something that it's a good idea. So we would do that. And then finally, we would come back at the end of all of this and sort of pull it all back together and make sure that the package looks good to the committee, and to see where you want to go from there.
You know, this week, Monday morning, we had a very significant meeting on the community's response to youth violence and issues like that. And that a lot of people that attended that meeting learned things that they didn't know, and I think this falls in that category. A lot of us that are deeply involved in these kind of things understand what is going on, but that's a kind of a small group of folks that does know. So it can't help but educate everyone. It seems like a positive thing to do for me. One more question.
And just one other to comment on that. I mean, I think it's incumbent upon the city to educate its citizens and residents about how we're spending their money and what the policies are. Again, I think we have an opportunity here also of looking at the other type of financial concerns that we have in the city, to use this public education piece to also talk about which types of funds is for which kinds of projects and services, because I hear a lot about, well, why don't we just take money from the airport and give it to the waterfront, or I don't know, I'm just, but mixing different budgets that you cannot do either through law or resolution or otherwise. And this might be a good opportunity for us to educate the public about what exactly constitutes the general fund versus all the different enterprise funds, and can they interrelate, and do they interrelate? And I think that we have a good opportunity here to do that, and especially with this conversation happening, and then the next budget hearings that are going to happen starting in April.
Okay, did you get enough feedback here?
I did, sir.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that.
Then I would. I think that concludes this part of the report today. I'd like to ask if there's any public comment. Now would be a good time if there's any public here. I don't see any. So I'm going to adjourn the meeting. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.